The flash drive trembled in my hands as FBI Agent Sarah Chen placed the evidence bag on the conference table between us. Ms. Rodriguez, what you've uncovered here will shut down one of the largest fraudulent operations we've seen in the pharmaceutical industry, she said, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting the gravity of what lay before us. Your former employer, Meridian BioTech, wasn't just cutting corners on drug testing, they were deliberately falsifying clinical trial data that put millions of patients at risk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months ago, I never could have imagined sitting in this sterile FBI field office in downtown Seattle, watching federal agents catalog evidence that would eventually lead to congressional hearings and industry-wide reforms. 6 months ago, I was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Senior Research Analyst at Meridian BioTech, proud of my corner office overlooking Puget Sound, my 6-figure salary, and my reputation as one of the most meticulous data scientists in pharmaceutical research. I had spent 12 years climbing the corporate ladder, earning my PhD in biochemistry from Stanford, publishing papers that shaped industry standards, and building what I thought was an unshakable career foundation. But as I stared at Agent Chen's serious expression and the mountain of evidence we'd spent the last 4 hours reviewing, I realized that everything I'd built my professional identity on had been constructed on a foundation of lies. The company I'd devoted my career to, the boss I'd respected and defended, the research I'd proudly contributed to, all of it had been part of an elaborate scheme that prioritized profits over human lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd always been the employee who followed protocols to the letter, who double-checked every calculation, who stayed late to ensure data accuracy. My colleagues used to joke that I was so thorough, I could spot a statistical anomaly from across the office. My supervisor, Dr. Marcus Blackwood, had praised my attention to detail in every performance review, calling me the kind of researcher who gives our industry credibility. He was right about one thing: I could spot anomalies. What he didn't anticipate was that eventually, I'd start noticing the patterns he'd been so carefully orchestrating. It started with small inconsistencies that nagged at the analytical part of my brain. Patient response rates that seemed too perfectly distributed. Side effect reports that mysteriously disappeared between preliminary and final submissions to the FDA. Test results that improved dramatically between draft and final versions with no explanation for the changes. For months, I dismissed these observations as my own paranoia, the kind of overthinking that came from spending too many late nights staring at spreadsheets and statistical models. After all, this was Meridian BioTech, a company with a sterling reputation, annual revenues exceeding $2.8 billion, and a track record of bringing life-saving medications to market. Dr. Blackwood wasn't just my supervisor. He was a respected figure in pharmaceutical research, frequently quoted in medical journals and invited to speak at international conferences. The idea that he might be involved in deliberate fraud seemed not just unlikely but impossible. But the inconsistencies kept accumulating, like drops of water eventually carving through stone. The breakthrough moment came on a rainy Thursday evening in March when I was working late on the quarterly compliance report. I'd been granted access to historical trial data for a new arthritis medication called Flexinol that was scheduled for FDA approval within weeks. As I cross-referenced the current submission with earlier internal reports, the numbers simply didn't match, not just minor discrepancies that might be explained by rounding errors or statistical adjustments, but fundamental alterations that changed the entire safety profile of the drug. According to the internal reports I discovered, Flexinol had shown severe liver complications in 18% of trial participants. But the FDA submission reported liver issues in only 3% of patients. The difference wasn't a mistake, it was a deliberate falsification that could put thousands of arthritis sufferers at risk of liver failure. My hands had shaken that night as I printed out both sets of documents, comparing them side by side under the harsh fluorescent lights of my empty office. This wasn't an anomaly or an oversight. This was criminal fraud on a scale that could destroy lives. And my signature was on some of the preliminary reports that had been altered without my knowledge. The weight of that discovery had kept me awake for 3 straight nights. I'd built my entire career on scientific integrity, on the belief that pharmaceutical research existed to help people live healthier lives. The realization that I'd been unknowingly complicit in endangering those same people felt like watching my professional identity collapse in real time. But sitting here now, watching Agent Chen organize evidence that would eventually lead to Dr. Blackwood's arrest and Meridian BioTech's dissolution, I understood that discovering those falsified reports had been the beginning of the most important work of my life. The career I'd lost by becoming a whistleblower had been replaced by something more meaningful: the knowledge that my actions had prevented contaminated medications from reaching patients who trusted the system to protect them. Before we dive into how a respected pharmaceutical researcher became the FBI's key witness in exposing one of the largest corporate fraud cases in medical history. Tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story of corporate corruption and the courage to expose it resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something even more shocking for you. My name is Dr. Elena Rodriguez, and for the past 12 years, I thought I was building a career in pharmaceutical research. What I discovered instead was that I'd been unknowingly participating in a criminal conspiracy that put corporate profits above human lives. The journey from respected researcher to FBI whistleblower taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do with your career is destroy it to protect something more valuable. The truth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Those words, criminal conspiracy, carried the weight of 12 years of dedicated service, countless late nights perfecting research protocols, and the gradual erosion of everything I'd believed about the pharmaceutical industry. 12 years of thinking I was part of something noble, something that helped people, only to discover I'd been a cog in a machine designed to exploit the very patients we claimed to serve. But the fraud at Meridian BioTech wasn't something that happened overnight. As I sat in that FBI conference room, Agent Chen walked me through a timeline that revealed just how long this deception had been growing, like a cancer spreading through every department of the company. What I thought were isolated incidents were actually part of a systematic pattern that stretched back nearly a decade. Long before I'd even joined the company, the pressure had been building for years, though I'd been too focused on my own career advancement to recognize the warning signs. When I first joined Meridian BioTech in 2011, fresh out of my PhD program at Stanford, the company was riding high on the success of their breakthrough diabetes medication, Glucomax. The drug had generated over $800 million in its first year alone, establishing Meridian as a major player in the pharmaceutical industry and making Dr. Blackwood something of a celebrity in research circles. But success breeds expectations, and those expectations become demands. Every quarterly earnings call, every board meeting, every interaction with investors carried the implicit message that Meridian needed to maintain its growth trajectory. New drugs needed to reach market faster. Clinical trials needed to show better results. Competitors were breathing down our necks with their own breakthrough medications, and the pressure to stay ahead was relentless. I remembered the subtle changes that had crept into our department meetings over the years. In my early days at Meridian, Dr. Blackwood would emphasize scientific rigor and patient safety above all else. Our reputation is built on the integrity of our research, he used to say during new employee orientations. One falsified data point could destroy decades of trust. But by 2016, those conversations had shifted. Suddenly, our weekly team meetings focused more on timeline acceleration and optimizing trial outcomes than on methodological accuracy. Dr. Blackwood began talking about the need to be creative with our data interpretation and finding ways to highlight positive results while contextualizing concerning findings. At the time, I interpreted these changes as natural evolution in a competitive industry. After all, other pharmaceutical companies were bringing drugs to market in record time. If we couldn't keep pace, patients would suffer from delayed access to potentially life-saving treatments. It seemed reasonable to streamline our processes and focus on the most promising aspects of our research. What I didn't realize was that streamlining had become a euphemism for systematic data manipulation. Those concerning side effects weren't being contextualized, they were being deleted. Patient complaints weren't being optimized, they were being ignored or attributed to unrelated causes. And those accelerated timelines weren't achieved through efficiency improvements, they were the result of skipping crucial safety verification steps. The financial stakes kept escalating year after year. By 2018, Meridian had committed to launching 4 new medications within 18 months to satisfy investor expectations and maintain our stock price. The research pipeline that should have taken 3 to 5 years was being compressed into a timeline that made thorough testing nearly impossible, but Dr. Blackwood assured us that we were simply becoming more sophisticated in our methodology. We're moving beyond the outdated paradigms that slow down medical progress, he explained during a company-wide presentation that I now realize was more indoctrination than education. Our advanced analytical techniques allow us to identify successful treatments faster than ever before. The human cost of this pressure wasn't immediately visible from my position in the data analysis department. I worked with spreadsheets and statistical models, not actual patients. The numbers I manipulated represented abstract data points, not real people dealing with chronic pain, diabetes, or life-threatening conditions. It was easy to maintain professional distance from the consequences of our research because those consequences were theoretical rather than tangible, but the pressure was affecting everyone differently. Dr. Sarah Martinez, who led our clinical Trials division, started taking anxiety medication and working even longer hours. She'd been at Meridian for 8 years and had always been one of the most confident researchers on our team. But I noticed her hands shaking during presentations and saw her staying in the office until midnight most nights, frantically revising trial protocols and patient monitoring procedures. James Chen, our lead statistician, became increasingly isolated and defensive about his work. He'd previously been collaborative and open to discussion about methodological approaches, but suddenly he was protective of his data analysis and resistant to the peer review process that had always been standard in our department. When I asked him about unusual patterns in some of his recent reports, he'd deflect or change the subject entirely. Even our administrative staff seemed affected by the mounting tension. Linda Thompson, Dr. Blackwood's executive assistant for over 6 years, went from being cheerful and organized to nervous and scattered. She started making uncharacteristic mistakes in scheduling and document management, as if the stress was affecting her ability to perform even routine tasks. The financial pressure wasn't just affecting our day-to-day operations, it was changing the fundamental culture of the company. Meridian had always prided itself on being a research-driven organization where scientific integrity guided business decisions. But gradually, business considerations began driving scientific choices. Budget meetings that used to focus on ensuring adequate funding for thorough research now centered on minimizing costs and maximizing profit margins. Equipment purchases were delayed or denied if they might slow down trial timelines. Staff requests for additional time to verify results were met with reminders about delivery deadlines and shareholder expectations. The transformation was so gradual that it felt like natural evolution rather than ethical degradation. Each compromise seemed reasonable in isolation: a shortened trial period here, a simplified safety protocol there, a focus on positive outcomes rather than comprehensive analysis. But these individual decisions were accumulating into a systematic abandonment of the scientific principles that had built Meridian's reputation. By 2019, the pressure had reached a breaking point. Dr. Blackwood was attending board meetings twice a week instead of once a month. Our department was being asked to provide preliminary results before trials were even halfway complete. And the gap between what we were discovering in our research and what we were reporting to regulatory agencies was becoming impossible to ignore. But I still trusted the system. I believed that Dr. Blackwood and the senior leadership team were navigating these pressures while maintaining our commitment to patient safety. I assumed that the discrepancies I was noticing were the result of my own limited perspective rather than systematic deception. That trust would soon prove to be the most dangerous assumption of my career. The weight of 12 years of gradual moral compromise was about to come crashing down, and I was about to discover that the respected pharmaceutical company I'd devoted my career to was nothing more than an elaborate criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate medical research. The pressure that had been building for years was about to explode, and I was standing directly in the blast radius. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on anyone who knew my background. Growing up in East Los Angeles as the daughter of Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, I was the girl who always colored inside the lines, who never cheated on tests even when everyone else was passing answers around the classroom, who turned and lost wallets to the police with every dollar still inside. My parents, both hardworking immigrants from Guadalajara, had instilled in me a moral compass so rigid that my siblings used to tease me about being impossibly honest. In high school, I was the student who reported cheating when I witnessed it, even though it made me unpopular with my classmates. When my chemistry teacher, Mr. Davidson, accidentally gave our class the answers to an upcoming exam, I was the only student who spoke up and told him about his mistake. While my peers groaned and called me names under their breath, Mr. Davidson pulled me aside after class and said something that would shape my entire career path. Elena, integrity in science isn't just about being honest, it's about protecting people's lives. Scientists who cut corners or falsify data can kill people. That conversation planted a seed that grew throughout my academic career. I pursued my undergraduate degree in biochemistry at UCLA with the singular focus of becoming a researcher who would uphold the highest ethical standards. I graduated summa cum laude, not because I was naturally brilliant, but because I was methodical, thorough, and absolutely unwilling to compromise on accuracy. My professors often commented on my unusual attention to detail and my tendency to double-check results that other students accepted at face value. During my PhD program at Stanford, I earned a reputation as the graduate student who could spot errors in published papers that had somehow passed peer review. My dissertation advisor, Dr. Catherine Williams, often joked that I had supernatural powers when it came to identifying statistical anomalies and methodological flaws. She recommended me for positions at several prestigious pharmaceutical companies. writing in her letter of recommendation that I was the kind of researcher who gives scientific integrity meaning in an industry that desperately needs more ethical leadership. But my strength in detecting irregularities wasn't just academic, it was deeply personal. My youngest sister, Carmen, had been diagnosed with juvenile diabetes when she was 8 years old. I'd watched my parents struggle to afford her insulin, seen them research every medication option, witnessed their relief when a new treatment helped stabilize her blood sugar levels. The pharmaceutical industry wasn't just my career choice, it was personal mission to ensure that families like mine had access to safe, effective medications. My expertise in data analysis had made me something of a legend in professional circles. Long before I joined Meridian BioTech, I'd published 17 peer-reviewed papers on statistical methodology in clinical trials, served as a reviewer for 3 major medical journals, and been invited to speak at international conferences about data integrity in pharmaceutical research. My LinkedIn profile had over 5,000 connections, and I regularly received job offers from companies across the biotech industry. At industry conferences, I was known as the researcher who asked the difficult questions during presentations, the one who politely but persistently challenged methodologies that seemed questionable. Other researchers respected my work enough that they would seek me out for consultation on their own studies. I'd helped identify flaws in clinical trial designs that could have led to dangerous medications reaching the market, and I'd collaborated with FDA officials on improving data verification protocols. My reputation for ethical excellence had even caught the attention of pharmaceutical industry watchdog organizations. The Alliance for Medical Research Integrity had invited me to join their advisory board, and I'd been quoted in several investigative journalism pieces about the importance of rigorous safety testing. When reporters needed expert commentary on pharmaceutical research standards, my phone would ring. The contrast between my professional reputation and my current situation was stark enough to be almost comical, if it weren't so terrifying. Here I was, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the woman who had built her entire career on exposing fraud and ensuring data integrity, discovering that I'd been working for a company that systematically falsified the very research I was supposed to be protecting. My colleagues at other pharmaceutical companies often asked me how I maintained such high standards while still meeting industry pressure for rapid results. I would explain that integrity and efficiency weren't mutually exclusive, that thorough methodology actually saved time in the long run by preventing costly recalls and regulatory investigations. I genuinely believed that Meridian BioTech shared these values, which was why I'd chosen to work there despite having offers from larger, more prestigious companies. My expertise wasn't limited to statistical analysis. I'd also developed innovative methodologies for detecting data manipulation that had been adopted by several other research institutions. I'd created algorithms that could identify suspicious patterns in clinical trial results, protocols for verifying patient data authenticity, and quality control measures that made research fraud significantly more difficult to execute. The software I'd developed for cross-referencing trial data had been licensed by 4 other pharmaceutical companies and was being used by FDA reviewers to evaluate drug applications. My work had literally created tools designed to prevent exactly the kind of fraud I was now discovering at my own company. The bitter irony was that if I'd run Meridian's data through my own fraud detection algorithms, I would have identified the problems years earlier. My personal life reflected the same commitment to ethical behavior that defined my professional identity. I volunteered at a free clinic in Seattle's International District, helping translate medical information for Spanish-speaking patients who couldn't afford regular health care. I served on the board of a nonprofit organization that provided emergency prescription assistance to families struggling with medical costs. Even my financial decisions reflected my values. I'd moved my retirement savings to socially responsible investment funds that specifically excluded companies with poor ethical track records. Friends and family often joked that I was pathologically honest, the kind of person who would drive back to a store if a cashier accidentally gave me too much change. My ex-boyfriend, David, used to tease me about being constitutionally incapable of moral flexibility. When we broke up, he said he admired my principles but found them exhausting to live with because I wouldn't even accept dinner at a restaurant if I suspected they were violating health codes. My apartment was filled with books about medical ethics, scientific integrity, and corporate responsibility. I subscribed to journals that specifically focused on research methodology and ethical standards in healthcare. My browser bookmarks included websites for pharmaceutical industry oversight organizations, FDA guidance documents, and academic articles about preventing research misconduct. The professional recognition I'd received for my ethical stance had been genuinely meaningful to me. I'd been featured in a medical ethics quarterly article titled "Young Researchers Leading the Charge for Industry Integrity." The piece described me as a rising star who proves that uncompromising ethical standards and professional success can go hand in hand. I'd kept a framed copy of that article on my office wall at Meridian, never imagining that it would eventually serve as evidence of how completely I'd been deceived about my employer's true nature. My expertise in detecting pharmaceutical fraud was so well established that I'd been asked to testify as an expert witness in several legal cases involving research misconduct. Attorneys would hire me to review clinical trial data and identify evidence of manipulation or falsification. I'd helped prosecutors build cases against researchers who had endangered patients by fabricating safety data. The depositions I'd given in those cases were now part of public record, documenting my professional commitment to exposing exactly the kind of criminal behavior I was discovering at Meridian BioTech. But perhaps the most painful aspect of my current situation was realizing how my own expertise had been turned against me. Dr. Blackwood hadn't just hired me despite my reputation for ethical rigor, he'd hired me because of it. My presence at Meridian BioTech provided credibility and cover for the company's fraudulent activities. When regulatory agencies or potential partners asked about Meridian's commitment to research integrity, they could point to my involvement as evidence of their ethical standards. I'd been unknowingly serving as a human shield, protecting Meridian's criminal enterprise with my own reputation for honesty and methodological excellence. The very principles that had defined my career had been weaponized against the patients I thought I was protecting. Everything changed on a cold February morning in 2020 when Dr. Blackwood called me into his office with an opportunity that seemed like the culmination of everything I'd worked toward in my career. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the Seattle skyline spread out behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing the kind of confident smile that had always made me feel like I was part of something important and meaningful. "Elena," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, "I have exciting news. The board has approved our recommendation to promote you to Director of Clinical Data Integrity, effective immediately." He slid a formal offer letter across the desk toward me, the company letterhead crisp and official. "This position comes with a 40% salary increase, stock options that will vest over the next 3 years, and most importantly, direct oversight of all clinical trial data validation for our most critical drug development programs." The promotion was everything I'd dreamed of since joining Meridian BioTech. Director-level positions in pharmaceutical companies typically took 15 to 20 years to achieve, and here I was being offered this opportunity after only 9 years in the industry. The salary increase would put me in the top 5% of earners in pharmaceutical research, and the stock options could be worth millions if Meridian's upcoming drug launches were successful, but it was the scope of responsibility that truly excited me. As Director of Clinical Data Integrity, I would have access to every aspect of Meridian's research operations. I'd be responsible for ensuring that all clinical trial data met the highest standards of accuracy and compliance before submission to regulatory agencies. It was the kind of position that would allow me to implement the ethical frameworks I'd been advocating for throughout my career. "Dr. Blackwood, this is incredible," I said, trying to contain my excitement as I reviewed the offer letter. "I'm honored that you and the board have this much confidence in my abilities." The document outlined responsibilities that seemed perfectly aligned with my expertise and passion for research integrity. I would be leading a team of 12 data analysts, working directly with FDA liaisons, and serving as Meridian's primary representative on industry committees focused on improving clinical trial standards. "Elena, there's no one more qualified for this role," Dr. Blackwood replied, his tone carrying the warmth and mentorship that had characterized our relationship since I'd joined the company. "Your reputation for methodological excellence is exactly what Meridian needs as we enter this next phase of growth. The board specifically requested you for this position after reviewing your work on the Glucomax post-market surveillance data." The timing of the promotion felt serendipitous. Meridian was preparing to launch 3 major medications over the next 18 months, representing potentially billions in revenue and the opportunity to help millions of patients worldwide. As Director of Clinical Data Integrity, I would be instrumental in ensuring these drugs met the highest safety and efficacy standards before reaching the market. "There is one aspect of this promotion that will require some adjustment," Dr. Blackwood continued, his expression becoming more serious. "Given the sensitive nature of the data you'll be accessing and the competitive landscape we're operating in, this position will require you to sign an enhanced confidentiality agreement. You'll be privy to information that could significantly impact Meridian's market position if it were to be disclosed prematurely." He handed me a thick document labeled Executive Level Non-Disclosure and Confidentiality Agreement. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed clauses that were far more restrictive than anything I'd signed before. The agreement prohibited me from discussing any aspect of Meridian's research operations with anyone outside the company, including family members, former colleagues, or industry contacts. It also included provisions for significant financial penalties if confidential information was disclosed, with potential damages reaching into the millions of dollars. This seems quite comprehensive, I said, noting sections that restricted my ability to publish academic papers based on work conducted at Meridian or to serve as a consultant for other pharmaceutical companies. Is this level of confidentiality standard for director-level positions? Elena, you have to understand that we're operating in an increasingly competitive environment, Dr. Blackwood explained. Our competitors would pay enormous sums for access to our clinical trial methodologies and research findings. This agreement simply ensures that Meridian's proprietary information remains protected while allowing you the access you need to excel in your new role. The explanation made sense from a business perspective, and I was eager to accept the promotion that represented such a significant advancement in my career. I signed both the promotion agreement and the confidentiality document that afternoon, feeling like I was finally being recognized for the expertise and ethical standards I'd spent years developing. My new office was on the 14th floor of Meridian's headquarters, with a view of Elliott Bay and direct access to the secure servers that contained all of the company's clinical trial data. The IT department provided me with enhanced security credentials that allowed me to access files that had previously been restricted to only the most senior leadership team. For the first time in my career, I had complete visibility into every aspect of Meridian's research operations. The transition into my new role began with a series of briefings from department heads across the company. Dr. Martinez walked me through the clinical trials division's current projects, highlighting the aggressive timelines that had been established for our upcoming drug launches. James Chen provided detailed explanations of the statistical methodologies being used to analyze trial results, emphasizing the importance of presenting data in ways that highlighted positive outcomes while contextualizing any concerning findings. Linda Thompson, Dr. Blackwood's executive assistant, gave me access to shared calendar systems and document repositories that contained the internal communications between Meridian's leadership team and our regulatory consultants. These files provided insights into the strategic decisions that shaped how we presented our research findings to the FDA and other regulatory agencies around the world, but it was during my third week in the new position that I encountered the information that would change everything. Dr. Blackwood had asked me to prepare a comprehensive review of all clinical trial data for Flexinol, the arthritis medication that was scheduled for FDA approval within the next 6 weeks. As the Director of Clinical Data Integrity, my job was to ensure that every piece of information in our regulatory submission was accurate and defensible. I began by accessing the complete Flexinol trial database, expecting to find the kind of rigorous, transparent research documentation that I'd been advocating for throughout my career. Instead, I discovered multiple versions of the same clinical trial reports, each showing different results for the same patient populations. The variations weren't minor adjustments or corrections, they were fundamental alterations to safety and efficacy data that completely changed the drug's risk-benefit profile. The enhanced access credentials that came with my promotion had inadvertently given me visibility into the very fraud I'd been unknowingly helping to conceal. As Director of Clinical Data Integrity, I was supposed to verify the accuracy of our regulatory submissions. But the complete database access revealed that there was no single accurate version to verify. Our submissions were composites of selectively chosen data points from multiple manipulated reports. My promotion hadn't been recognition of my ethical standards, it had been a calculated move to make me complicit in the systematic fraud that Dr. Blackwood had been orchestrating for years. The enhanced confidentiality agreement I'd signed wasn't designed to protect Meridian's competitive advantage, it was designed to prevent me from reporting the criminal activity I was now discovering. The position that should have represented the pinnacle of my career in pharmaceutical research had instead made me an unwilling participant in exactly the kind of research misconduct I'd devoted my professional life to preventing. The irony was devastating. By achieving my dream job, I'd walked directly into the center of a criminal conspiracy that violated every principle I believed in. As I sat in my new office that evening, looking out at the Seattle skyline while scrolling through page after page of falsified clinical trial data, I realized that my promotion hadn't been the beginning of my real career, it had been the end of my ability to maintain the illusion that Meridian BioTech was the ethical company I'd believed it to be. The enhanced access that came with my new role was about to reveal the full scope of the fraud that had been hidden behind layers of departmental separation and restricted information access. And the confidentiality agreement I'd signed meant that exposing this fraud would likely destroy my career and potentially result in millions of dollars in legal penalties. I was no longer just a researcher who had stumbled across concerning data. I Was a director-level executive with legal and moral responsibility for ensuring the integrity of information that I now knew was fundamentally fraudulent. The promotion that had seemed like recognition of my expertise had actually been a trap that made whistleblowing both more necessary and more dangerous than I could have imagined. Over the next 3 months, I threw myself into what I thought was due diligence but was actually an increasingly desperate attempt to find legitimate explanations for the irregularities I kept discovering in Meridian's research data. Every morning, I arrived at the office at 6:30, hoping that fresh eyes and systematic analysis would reveal reasonable justifications for the discrepancies that haunted my sleep. I started with the assumption that I was missing something, that my concerns stemmed from incomplete understanding of Meridian's sophisticated research methodologies rather than actual fraud. After all, Dr. Blackwood had 23 years of experience in pharmaceutical research, and the company had successfully brought 12 medications to market with FDA approval. Surely there were legitimate statistical techniques or regulatory strategies that could explain the variations I was seeing in our clinical trial data. My first approach was to schedule meetings with every department head who had contributed to the Flexinol research. I prepared detailed questions about patient recruitment criteria, data collection protocols, and statistical analysis methodologies. I reviewed published academic papers on similar arthritis treatments, looking for precedents that might explain why our internal reports showed different results than our regulatory submissions. Dr. Martinez, who led our clinical trials division, seemed increasingly uncomfortable during our weekly review sessions. When I asked about the 18% liver complication rate in the internal reports versus the 3% rate in the FDA submission, she shifted in her chair and consulted notes that she'd never needed before. "Elena, the difference reflects our evolving understanding of causation versus correlation," she explained, her voice lacking the confidence I'd always associated with her presentations. "The higher percentage includes all liver enzyme elevations, regardless of severity or duration. The FDA submission focuses specifically on clinically significant hepatic events that required intervention or hospitalization. But when I requested the detailed case reports that would support this distinction, Dr. Martinez said they were still being compiled by our external clinical research organization. The data is very complex," she added, "and our CRO partners need additional time to ensure the case narratives meet FDA formatting requirements." James Chen, our lead statistician, became even more evasive when I tried to understand his analytical methodologies. Previously, he'd been eager to discuss statistical techniques and had welcomed peer review of his work. But now he seemed defensive about questions that should have been routine for someone in his position. "The statistical models we're using are proprietary algorithms that I developed specifically for Meridian," he told me during one particularly frustrating meeting. "The methodology is too complex to explain without extensive background and advanced biostatistics. You'll just have to trust that the results are valid." This response was particularly troubling because I had extensive background in biostatistics, more than James himself, based on our respective publications and academic credentials. His reluctance to explain his methods suggested that either his techniques were fundamentally flawed or that he was concealing something more serious than methodological complexity. Linda Thompson, Dr. Blackwood's executive assistant, began restricting my access to certain document repositories that had previously been available to me. When I asked about files related to earlier versions of the Flexinol clinical trial reports, she claimed that those documents had been archived according to standard data retention policies and would require special authorization to retrieve. "Dr. Blackwood is very busy preparing for the FDA Advisory Committee meeting," she said apologetically. "Perhaps we could schedule a time next month to discuss your archival access needs." But next month would be after the Flexinol approval decision, making any review of historical data essentially meaningless. I began working 16-hour days, staying in the office until security guards had to escort me out of the building. I cross-referenced every piece of data I could access, looking for patterns that might reveal systematic errors rather than intentional manipulation. I created detailed spreadsheets tracking patient outcomes, side effect reports, and dosage modifications across multiple clinical sites. The more I investigated, the more convinced I became that something was fundamentally wrong with our research processes. But every attempt to get clarification or additional information was met with delays, deflections, or claims that the data I was requesting was either unavailable or too sensitive to share with someone at my level, despite my new director-level position. Dr. Blackwood suggested that my concerns reflected the natural adjustment period that came with increased responsibility and access to sensitive information. "Elena, you're seeing the complexity of pharmaceutical research for the first time," he said during one of our increasingly tense meetings. "The regulatory submission process requires strategic presentation of data to ensure that safe, effective medications reach patients as quickly as possible. What you're interpreting as inconsistencies are actually sophisticated approaches to regulatory science. But I'd spent my entire career studying regulatory science, and nothing I was seeing at Meridian aligned with established best practices or ethical guidelines. The strategic presentation Dr. Blackwood described sounded more like selective reporting and data manipulation than legitimate regulatory strategy. My frustration intensified when I tried to consult with external experts who might provide perspective on the methodological issues I was encountering. The enhanced confidentiality agreement I'd signed severely restricted my ability to discuss specific aspects of Meridian's research with anyone outside the company. I couldn't seek guidance from former colleagues, academic mentors, or industry contacts without potentially violating the legal constraints of my employment. I attempted to frame my questions in hypothetical terms when speaking with Dr. Catherine Williams, my former dissertation advisor at Stanford. Suppose a researcher discovered multiple versions of the same clinical trial report with significantly different safety profiles, I said during a carefully worded phone conversation. What would be appropriate next steps for investigating these discrepancies? Dr. Williams' response was immediate and unambiguous. Elena, that would be a serious red flag requiring immediate investigation and possible reporting to regulatory authorities. Multiple versions of clinical trial reports with different safety data could indicate research misconduct or fraud. But her guidance only deepened my dilemma. I was increasingly convinced that I was witnessing exactly the kind of research misconduct she described. But my employment agreement prevented me from seeking the kind of external verification and support that would be necessary to proceed with any formal allegations. Sleep became elusive as I lay awake replaying conversations with colleagues and reviewing the evidence I'd accumulated. My appetite disappeared, and I lost 12 pounds over 6 weeks without making any conscious effort to diet. Friends began commenting on my appearance and asking if I was feeling well, but I couldn't explain the source of my stress without potentially violating my confidentiality obligations. The isolation was particularly difficult because I'd always been collaborative in my approach to complex research challenges. Throughout my career, I'd relied on peer consultation and external review to validate my conclusions and ensure that I wasn't missing important considerations. But now I was forced to analyze potentially criminal activity in complete isolation, without access to the professional networks that had always been crucial to my decision-making process. My relationship with my sister Carmen became strained as I struggled to explain why I seemed so distracted and stressed during our weekly phone calls. As someone whose life depended on pharmaceutical research, her diabetes management relied on medications produced by companies like Meridian. She was particularly interested in my work. But I couldn't share my growing concerns about drug safety and research integrity without potentially exposing myself to legal liability. Elena, you sound exhausted, she said during one particularly difficult conversation. Is everything okay at work? You used to love talking about your research, but now you seem almost afraid to discuss it. Her observation was more accurate than she realized. I was afraid of what I was discovering, afraid of the legal consequences of speaking out, and afraid that my inability to resolve these concerns internally meant that potentially dangerous medications might reach patients like her. By April 2020, my frustration had evolved into something approaching desperation. Every traditional approach I'd tried for addressing research concerns had been blocked or deflected. The internal reporting mechanisms I'd always trusted seemed designed to protect the company rather than investigate legitimate allegations of misconduct. And the external resources I'd relied on throughout my career were now off-limits due to confidentiality restrictions. I was trapped in a position where I had both the responsibility and the access necessary to identify research fraud, but lacked the institutional support or legal protection necessary to address what I was discovering. The promotion that had seemed like recognition of my expertise had actually isolated me from the professional networks and ethical frameworks that had always guided my career decisions. The mounting evidence of systematic fraud was becoming undeniable. But my ability to respond to this evidence was constrained by the very employment arrangements that had given me access to it in the first place. I was discovering that being right about research misconduct was meaningless if you lacked the power or protection necessary to act on that knowledge. The moment that shattered my remaining faith in Meridian BioTech arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening in May 2020, when I was alone in my office reviewing what I thought would be routine safety monitoring reports for our recently approved medications. The building was empty except for security guards, and the only sounds were the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of late-night traffic on Interstate 5. I'd been working through a backlog of post-market surveillance data for Glucomax, our diabetes medication that had been on the market for 3 years. As Director of Clinical Data Integrity, part of my responsibility was to review adverse event reports and ensure that any concerning safety signals were properly investigated and reported to the FDA. It was typically mundane work. Most adverse events were either unrelated to the medication or represented known side effects that were already documented in the drug's labeling, but as I scrolled through the latest batch of reports, I noticed an unusual pattern in the data that made my stomach drop. Over the past 6 months, there had been 47 reports of severe hypoglycemic episodes in Glucomax patients, episodes so severe that they required emergency room treatment or hospitalization. These weren't the mild blood sugar fluctuations that were common with diabetes medications. These were life-threatening medical emergencies that could result in coma or death if not treated immediately. What made this pattern particularly alarming was that severe hypoglycemia hadn't been identified as a significant risk during Glucomax's clinical trials. The drug had been approved specifically because it appeared to provide effective blood sugar control with minimal risk of dangerous hypoglycemic episodes. That safety profile had been one of the key selling points that had made Glucomax a billion-dollar success for Meridian. I cross-referenced the adverse event reports with our original clinical trial data, expecting to find some explanation for why we were now seeing safety signals that hadn't appeared during the pre-approval studies. What I discovered instead was evidence that we had seen these signals during the clinical trials, but they had been systematically excluded from our FDA submission. The complete clinical trial database contained 127 reports of severe hypoglycemic episodes during the Glucomax studies. But when I compared this to the safety summary that had been submitted to the FDA, only 18 of these episodes were included in the regulatory filing. The remaining 109 episodes had been classified as unrelated to study medication or attributed to protocol violations that excluded them from the official safety analysis. I spent the next 3 hours meticulously reviewing the case reports for the excluded hypoglycemic episodes, looking for legitimate reasons why they might have been omitted from the regulatory submission. What I found instead was a clear pattern of post hoc justifications that had been used to remove any adverse event that might have threatened Glucomax's approval. Patients who experienced severe hypoglycemia were retroactively classified as having underlying conditions that made them unsuitable for the study, even though these same conditions had been present when they were enrolled in the trial. Episodes that occurred during the study period were reclassified as happening outside the assessment window, even when hospital records clearly documented that they had occurred while patients were taking Glucomax according to the study protocol. The most disturbing discovery was a series of email exchanges between Dr. Blackwood and our regulatory consultants discussing strategies for optimizing the safety narrative for the Glucomax submission. These emails, which I found in archived folders that my enhanced access credentials allowed me to view, revealed a calculated effort to manipulate the safety data to support FDA approval. "We need to be creative about causality assessments for the hypoglycemic events," Dr. Blackwood had written to our lead regulatory consultant in March 2017. "The current numbers would trigger additional safety requirements that could delay approval by 12 to 18 months. Can we develop alternative explanations for the more severe episodes?" The regulatory consultant's response was equally damning. "I've reviewed the case reports and identified several opportunities to reclassify events as unrelated to study drug. We can attribute most of the severe episodes to patient noncompliance, concurrent medications, or pre-existing conditions that weren't adequately documented during screening. This wasn't a case of borderline judgment calls or reasonable differences in medical interpretation. This was systematic fraud designed to conceal life-threatening side effects from the regulatory agency responsible for protecting public health. And these fraudulent safety assessments had led directly to the approval of a medication that was now causing the exact serious adverse events that had been hidden from the FDA. But the horror of this discovery was compounded by my realization of what it meant for the current post-market surveillance data I was reviewing. The 47 severe hypoglycemic episodes that had been reported over the past 6 months weren't unexpected complications. They were predictable consequences of safety risks that Meridian had known about and deliberately concealed during the approval process. Patients like my sister Carmen, who relied on medications like Glucomax to manage their diabetes, were being endangered because Meridian had prioritized market approval over patient safety. The families who trusted pharmaceutical companies to provide accurate safety information were making medical decisions based on deliberately falsified data. I printed out the most damaging emails and case reports, my hands shaking as the pages emerged from the printer. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Meridian hadn't just cut corners or made questionable judgment calls. The company had engaged in systematic fraud that had already resulted in preventable hospitalizations and could potentially lead to patient deaths. As I sat surrounded by hundreds Of pages of evidence, I realized that my months of hoping to find innocent explanations for the data discrepancies had been naive. There were no innocent explanations. Meridian BioTech was a criminal enterprise that had been systematically endangering patients for years, and I had been unknowingly helping to provide legitimacy for their operations. The weight of this realization was overwhelming. I thought about the pride I'd felt when Glucomax was approved, the satisfaction of believing that my work had contributed to a medication that would help millions of diabetes patients worldwide. I remembered the company celebration when the drug reached $500 million in annual sales, and Dr. Blackwood's speech about how our team had changed the lives of patients around the globe. But none of that had been real. The success I'd been proud of was built on fraud that was actively harming the patients we claimed to serve. The career I'd devoted to ethical pharmaceutical research had been co-opted by criminals who had used my reputation and expertise to provide cover for their illegal activities. The emails I discovered also revealed that I wasn't the first employee to raise concerns about data integrity at Meridian. Dr. Rebecca Foster, a former clinical research director who had left the company in 2018, had apparently questioned the safety data for Glucomax during the approval process. According to the email exchanges, her concerns had been addressed through reorganization of departmental responsibilities and enhanced focus on regulatory strategy training. I remembered Dr. Foster's departure, which had been described as a voluntary career change to pursue opportunities in academia. But the emails suggested that she had been forced out because she had been asking the same kinds of questions that were now keeping me awake at night. Her departure had served as a warning to other employees about the consequences of challenging Meridian's data practices. The isolation I'd been feeling for months suddenly made sense. Other employees had recognized the signs of research misconduct, but had chosen to remain silent rather than risk their careers. The evasive responses I'd been getting from colleagues weren't just protective of confidential information, they were protective of a criminal conspiracy that everyone knew about but no one was willing to address. By 3 a.m., I was sitting on the floor of my office, surrounded by evidence of fraud that could destroy Meridian BioTech and potentially send Dr. Blackwood and other executives to prison. But I was also facing the reality that exposing this fraud would likely destroy my own career and expose me to millions of dollars in legal liability under the confidentiality agreement I'd signed. The promotion that had seemed like the pinnacle of my professional achievements had actually been a trap designed to make me complicit in ongoing criminal activity. My enhanced access to clinical trial data had revealed the full scope of Meridian's fraud, but my enhanced legal obligations made it exponentially more dangerous to report what I discovered. As dawn broke over Seattle and early commuters began filling the streets below my office window, I faced a choice that would define not just my career but my fundamental identity as a person. I could remain silent and continue collecting a substantial salary while patients were endangered by medications I knew to be more dangerous than their labels indicated. Or I could report what I discovered and accept the likelihood that doing so would destroy everything I'd worked to build over the past 12 years. The evidence of fraud was undeniable, but the cost of exposing it seemed almost unbearable. I was no longer just a researcher who had stumbled across concerning data, I was someone with definitive proof of criminal activity that was actively harming patients, and the legal and moral weight of that knowledge was crushing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, my sister Carmen, during what I thought would be a routine family dinner at our parents' house in East Los Angeles. I'd driven down from Seattle for the weekend, hoping that time away from the office might provide some clarity about the impossible situation I was facing. But the weight of what I'd discovered at Meridian followed me everywhere, making it difficult to focus on normal family conversations about work, relationships, and weekend plans. Carmen had been managing her diabetes for 15 years, and she'd become something of an expert on pharmaceutical research and drug development. She regularly attended diabetes education seminars, participated in online patient advocacy groups, and stayed current with medical literature about new treatment options. What I hadn't realized was how much she'd learned about the regulatory approval process and patient safety monitoring. "Elena, you seem really distracted," she said as we sat on my parents' back patio after dinner, watching the sun set behind the San Gabriel Mountains. "Is everything okay at Meridian? You used to love talking about your research, but lately you seem almost afraid to mention your work." I'd been carefully avoiding any discussion of my job for months, claiming that confidentiality agreements prevented me from sharing details about current projects. But Carmen's direct question, combined with my exhaustion from carrying this burden alone, broke down my usual defenses. "Carmen, what would you do if you discovered that a medication you were taking wasn't as safe as the company claimed?" I asked, trying to frame the question hypothetically while seeking guidance from someone whose life depended on pharmaceutical safety. Her response was immediate and passionate. "I'd want to know the truth, no matter how scary it might be. Elena, when you're dependent on medications to stay alive, you need accurate information to make informed decisions about your health. If a company was hiding safety risks, they'd be stealing my ability to protect myself. She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. Actually, there's something I've been meaning to ask you about. I've been participating in an online support group for diabetes patients, and several people have mentioned scary episodes with glucomax, severe low blood sugar that sent them to the emergency room. The weird thing is that these episodes seem to be happening more frequently than what the prescribing information suggests. My stomach dropped as Carmen continued. One woman in my support group, Maria from Phoenix, ended up in a coma last month because her blood sugar crashed so severely. Her doctor said it was the worst hypoglycemic episode he'd ever seen in a glucomax patient. But when Maria tried to report it to the manufacturer, she got a form letter saying that her episode was likely unrelated to the medication. Carmen pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots from the diabetes support group forum. Thread after thread documented glucomax patients experiencing severe hypoglycemic episodes that required emergency medical treatment. The stories were heartbreakingly similar to the case reports I'd been reviewing in Meridian's post-market surveillance database. Elena, you work for the company that makes glucomax, Carmen said, her voice filled with trust and expectation. Are these episodes something patients should be worried about? Is there information that might help people like me stay safe? The weight of her question was crushing. My sister was asking me to fulfill the exact responsibility I'd taken on when I became Director of Clinical Data Integrity, protecting patients by ensuring they had accurate safety information. But providing that protection would require me to violate the confidentiality agreement that was keeping me trapped in silence. I looked at Carmen's earnest face and thought about the dozens of patients in her support group who were experiencing preventable medical emergencies. Something fundamental shifted in my perspective. I'd been approaching this situation as a career dilemma, weighing my professional obligations against legal risks and financial consequences. But Carmen's question reframed it as a moral imperative that transcended personal considerations. Carmen, I need to ask you something, I said, my voice steadier than I'd felt in months. If exposing safety information could help protect patients but might destroy the career of the person who revealed it, what would you want that person to do? Without hesitation, she responded, I'd want them to protect the patients. Elena, careers can be rebuilt, but people who die from preventable medical complications can't be brought back to life. Her words crystallized everything I'd been struggling with for months. I'd been paralyzed by fear of personal consequences while patients were suffering from preventable harm. My obsession with protecting my career and avoiding legal liability had made me complicit in the ongoing endangerment of people like my sister. That night, I called Dr. Catherine Williams, my former dissertation advisor at Stanford, and asked if we could meet in person to discuss a hypothetical research ethics dilemma. She agreed to see me the following weekend at her office in Palo Alto, probably assuming I needed guidance on a relatively routine professional challenge. Dr. Williams listened carefully as I described the situation in general terms, without mentioning Meridian by name or providing specific details that might violate my confidentiality agreement. I explained the discovery of systematic data manipulation, the concealment of serious adverse events, and the legal constraints that prevented traditional reporting mechanisms. Elena, this isn't a hypothetical dilemma, she said after I finished presenting the scenario. This is a description of serious research misconduct that requires immediate reporting to appropriate authorities. The legal agreements you've signed don't supersede your ethical obligations as a scientist or your moral responsibilities as a human being. She pulled out a well-worn copy of the Nuremberg Code and read from the section about informed consent and voluntary participation in medical research. These principles exist because patients have the right to make informed decisions about their medical care. When pharmaceutical companies conceal safety risks, they're violating the fundamental trust that makes modern medicine possible. Dr. Williams then explained something that I hadn't fully understood about whistleblower protections in pharmaceutical research. Elena, if you have evidence of fraud that affects drug safety, there are federal protections for employees who report this information to appropriate agencies. The False Claims Act specifically protects pharmaceutical employees who expose fraud in FDA submissions. This was information that Dr. Blackwood and Meridian's legal team had never mentioned when discussing my obligations under the confidentiality agreement. In fact, they had actively discouraged me from seeking external guidance about research ethics concerns, claiming that such discussions would violate my employment terms. But more importantly, Dr. Williams continued, you need to consider what kind of scientist and what kind of person you want to be. Your career will eventually end, but the consequences of your choices during moments like this will define your legacy and your ability to live with yourself. She recommended that I contact Dr. Amanda Foster at the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, who specialized in pharmaceutical fraud cases. Dr. Williams also provided information about the Government Accountability Project, a nonprofit organization that provided legal support and protection for whistleblowers in government-regulated industries. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a path forward that didn't require me to choose between my career and my conscience. The legal protections Dr. Williams described meant that exposing Meridian's fraud might not result in the career destruction and financial ruin I'd been fearing. And even if it did, Carmen's words had helped me understand that some things were more important than personal security. The drive back to Seattle gave me 8 hours to think about the choice I was facing and the perspective that had finally emerged from months of confusion and paralysis. I wasn't just a pharmaceutical researcher who had discovered concerning data. I was someone with the knowledge, access, and evidence necessary to prevent ongoing patient harm. My struggle to find innocent explanations for Meridian's data discrepancies had been misguided from the beginning. The evidence had always pointed toward systematic fraud, but I'd been too invested in protecting my career and maintaining my comfortable illusions about the company to accept what was obvious. Carmen's trust in me to provide honest information about medication safety had reminded me why I'd chosen pharmaceutical research as a career in the first place. I hadn't become a scientist to build wealth or achieve professional status. I'd chosen this field because I wanted to help ensure that patients had access to safe, effective treatments. The legal protections Dr. Williams had described meant that I might be able to fulfill my ethical obligations without destroying my ability to continue working in pharmaceutical research. But even if reporting Meridian's fraud resulted in career consequences, I'd finally found a perspective that made those consequences seem manageable. By the time I reached Seattle, I'd made the decision that would transform me from a conflicted employee into a federal whistleblower. I was going to gather every piece of evidence I could access, document the full scope of Meridian's fraud, and report everything to the appropriate federal agencies. The months of isolation and internal struggle were about to end. I was finally ready to become the kind of scientist I'd always claimed to be, someone who prioritized patient safety over personal comfort and who had the courage to act on her ethical convictions even when doing so required significant personal sacrifice. The next 6 weeks became the most intense and methodical investigation of my career, as I transformed from a conflicted employee into a systematic evidence gatherer. Every skill I'd developed over 12 years in pharmaceutical research, data analysis, document review, statistical verification, was now being applied to building an airtight case against my own employer. The irony wasn't lost on me that Meridian had unknowingly trained me to become the perfect whistleblower. My first step was to establish a secure system for documenting and preserving evidence that couldn't be traced back to my work computer or office activities. I purchased a personal laptop with cash and set up encrypted cloud storage accounts using a new email address. Every evening after my colleagues left the office, I would systematically photograph and copy documents using my enhanced access credentials, building a comprehensive record of Meridian's fraudulent activities. The fraud detection methodologies I'd developed earlier in my career became invaluable tools for mapping the full scope of Meridian's criminal enterprise. I created detailed flowcharts showing how legitimate clinical trial data was systematically altered before submission to regulatory agencies. I documented the chain of command involved in approving these alterations, with email trails that clearly showed Dr. Blackwood's direct involvement in orchestrating the fraud, working with the Government Accountability Project, which Dr. Williams had recommended. I learned about the specific types of evidence that would be most valuable to federal investigators. Their legal team taught me how to organize my findings in ways that would be compelling to FBI agents and federal prosecutors who might not have extensive backgrounds in pharmaceutical research. The key is telling a clear story that non-experts can follow, explained Sarah Mitchell, the Gap attorney who was providing guidance on my case. You need to show not just that fraud occurred, but how it occurred, who was responsible, and what the real-world consequences have been for patients. I began creating detailed case studies that connected specific instances of data manipulation to actual patient harm. For each medication where I found evidence of concealed safety risks, I researched post-market adverse event reports to identify patients who had suffered preventable injuries. These individual stories transformed abstract statistics into human consequences that would be impossible for investigators to ignore. The Glucomax case became my primary focus because the evidence was most comprehensive and the patient harm was most clearly documented. I created a timeline showing how 127 severe hypoglycemic episodes had been systematically excluded from the FDA submission, followed by detailed analysis of the 40-plus emergency room visits that had occurred since the drug's approval. Each case represented a family that had trusted Meridian to provide accurate safety information and had been betrayed by that trust. My background in statistical analysis proved crucial for identifying patterns that might not be obvious to investigators without extensive research experience. I developed algorithms that could detect anomalies in clinical trial data that suggested manipulation or selective reporting. These same tools revealed similar patterns of fraud in 3 other Meridian medications that were currently under FDA review. The scope of what I was discovering was staggering. Meridian's fraud wasn't limited to isolated incidents or individual medications. It was a systematic approach to drug development that prioritized market approval over patient safety across the company's entire research portfolio. Every medication that Meridian had brought to market over the past 5 years showed evidence of safety data manipulation. Working with Dr. Amanda Foster from the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, I learned how to present evidence in formats that would be useful for federal prosecutors building criminal cases. Dr. Foster taught me about the legal standards for proving intent and conspiracy in pharmaceutical fraud cases, helping me identify the specific documents and communications that would be most damaging to Meridian's executives. Elena, what you've uncovered here goes beyond typical regulatory violations, Dr. Foster told me during one of our encrypted video conferences. This is systematic fraud that meets the criteria for RICO prosecution. The evidence you're gathering could result in criminal charges that carry significant prison sentences. I began recording conversations with colleagues who made incriminating statements about Meridian's data practices. Using a smartphone app recommended by the Gap legal team, I documented instances where Dr. Blackwood or other executives explicitly discussed strategies for concealing safety risks from regulatory agencies. These recordings provided direct evidence of criminal intent that would be crucial for federal prosecutors. The technical skills I developed for detecting research fraud became even more sophisticated as I learned to identify increasingly subtle forms of data manipulation. I discovered that Meridian had been using advanced statistical techniques to obscure safety signals while maintaining plausible deniability about their methods. The company had essentially weaponized legitimate analytical tools to commit more sophisticated fraud. My daily routine became a carefully choreographed operation designed to gather maximum evidence while avoiding detection by Meridian's security systems. I arrived at work early and stayed late, using the additional time to access restricted databases and copy documents that would be crucial for the federal investigation. My enhanced security credentials allowed me to access files from every department, creating a comprehensive picture of how the fraud operated throughout the organization. The emotional toll of this double life was significant, but I'd found ways to manage the stress that had previously been overwhelming. Regular communication with the Gap legal team and FBI investigators provided psychological support and validation that I was doing important work. Carmen's encouragement during our weekly phone calls reminded me why patient safety had to take priority over personal comfort. I developed increasingly sophisticated methods for verifying the authenticity and accuracy of the evidence I was gathering, cross-referencing internal documents with external sources like FDA databases and published medical literature helped ensure that my allegations would withstand scrutiny from Meridian's legal team. Every piece of evidence was documented with timestamps, source verification, and chain of custody information that would be admissible in federal court. The investigation skills I was developing extended beyond document analysis to include human intelligence gathering. I began building relationships with other employees who had expressed concerns about Meridian's practices, carefully probing for additional information without revealing my own activities. Several colleagues provided crucial insights about fraud in departments I hadn't been able to access directly. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the former clinical research director who had been forced out in 2018, agreed to speak with me after I contacted her through her current position at UC San Francisco. Her detailed knowledge of earlier fraud at Meridian provided historical context that strengthened the case for systematic criminal activity rather than isolated incidents. Elena, what you're doing takes incredible courage, Dr. Foster told me during a carefully arranged meeting in San Francisco. I regret not speaking up when I had the chance, but the legal protections available now weren't in place when I discovered the fraud. You have opportunities to stop this that I didn't have. She provided additional evidence about fraud in medications that had been developed before my tenure at Meridian, extending the timeline of criminal activity back nearly a decade. Her testimony would be crucial for establishing the scope and duration of the conspiracy in ways that would maximize criminal penalties for the executives involved. By the end of July 2020, I had assembled a comprehensive case file that included over 3,000 pages of internal documents, dozens of recorded conversations, statistical analysis proving systematic data manipulation, and detailed case studies connecting the fraud to specific instances of patient harm. The evidence was organized in formats that would be useful to FBI investigators, federal prosecutors, and congressional oversight committees, the methodical approach I'd taken to building the case meant that Meridian's executives would have limited options for defense or deflection. The evidence clearly showed deliberate intent to defraud regulatory agencies, systematic concealment of safety risks, and direct harm to patients who had trusted the company to provide accurate medical information. Working with federal investigators had taught me skills that went far beyond traditional pharmaceutical research. I'd learned about criminal law, evidence preservation, witness protection, and federal prosecution strategies. The expertise I was developing would be valuable not just for this case, but for future efforts to combat pharmaceutical fraud throughout the industry. The transformation from conflicted employee to confident federal witness was complete. I had the evidence, the legal support, and the investigative skills necessary to hold Meridian accountable for their criminal activities. More importantly, I'd found a sense of purpose and moral clarity that had been missing during the months of uncertainty and internal struggle. The decision to go public with my allegations came in August 2020, when I realized that the federal investigation alone wouldn't be sufficient to prevent immediate harm to patients. While FBI agents and federal prosecutors were meticulously building their criminal case against Meridian BioTech, thousands of patients were still taking medications with concealed safety risks. The bureaucratic pace of criminal justice meant that it could be months or even years before the dangerous medications were removed from the market. Dr. Amanda Foster from the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations had been encouraging about the strength of my evidence, but she'd also been clear about the timeline for federal action. "Elena, we need to ensure that our investigation is thorough and that the evidence will hold up in court," she explained during one of our secure video conferences. "This means we can't take immediate regulatory action that might compromise the criminal prosecution." But my sister Carmen's diabetes support group was continuing to document severe hypoglycemic episodes among Glucomax patients, and I was receiving increasingly urgent messages from patients who had been harmed by Meridian's medications. The disconnect between the deliberate pace of federal investigation and the ongoing emergency facing patients had become unbearable. Sarah Mitchell from the Government Accountability Project suggested that I consider testifying before Congress as a way to expedite public awareness and regulatory action. Congressional testimony creates public pressure that can accelerate FDA response while supporting rather than undermining the criminal investigation, she explained. Your story could help other pharmaceutical employees find the courage to report similar fraud. The prospect of testifying before Congress was terrifying, but it also represented an opportunity to warn patients and healthcare providers about the safety risks that Meridian had concealed. Working with GAP's communications team, I prepared detailed testimony that would expose the company's fraud while encouraging other potential whistleblowers to come forward with information about similar activities at other pharmaceutical companies. My first public appearance was before the House Oversight and Reform Committee's Subcommittee on Health, where I testified about the specific mechanisms that Meridian had used to manipulate clinical trial data. The hearing room was packed with journalists, patient advocates, and pharmaceutical industry representatives who had come to hear firsthand accounts of research fraud from someone with direct access to internal company documents. "Members of the committee," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected despite the cameras and crowd, "I appear before you today not as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but as a scientist who has discovered that her employer has been systematically endangering patients for profit. The evidence I will present shows that Meridian BioTech has engaged in criminal fraud that has already resulted in preventable hospitalizations and could lead to patient deaths if not immediately addressed." The 3 hours of testimony that followed were unlike anything I'd experienced in my professional career. I walked committee members through specific examples of data manipulation, explained how safety signals had been concealed from regulatory agencies, and presented case studies of patients who had been harmed by medications with falsified safety profiles. The questions from both Republican and Democratic representatives were sharp and well-informed, reflecting the bipartisan concern about pharmaceutical fraud. Representative Maria Gonzalez from California, whose own father had been hospitalized after a severe hypoglycemic episode while taking Glucomax, was particularly pointed in her questioning. "Dr. Rodriguez, can you estimate how many patients might have been harmed by the safety risks that Meridian concealed from the FDA? Based on the post-market surveillance data I've reviewed, I estimate that at least 400 patients have experienced serious adverse events that could have been prevented if accurate safety information had been provided to healthcare providers," I replied. "These numbers represent only the cases that have been formally reported to the company. The actual number of affected patients is likely much higher." The impact of my congressional testimony was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, my secure email account had received over 200 messages from patients, healthcare providers, and pharmaceutical employees who had witnessed similar fraud at other companies. Each message represented another piece of evidence that Meridian's criminal activities were part of a broader pattern of industry misconduct. Dr. Jennifer Park, an emergency physician from Portland, wrote, "Dr. Rodriguez, your testimony explains patterns I've been seeing in my emergency department. We've had multiple patients hospitalized with severe hypoglycemic episodes after starting Glucomax, but when we tried to report these cases to the manufacturer, we were told they were unrelated to the medication. Your courage in speaking out may have saved lives." Even more significant were the messages from employees at other pharmaceutical companies who described witnessing similar data manipulation at their own workplaces. A clinical research coordinator from Boston wrote, "I've been documenting safety signal suppression at my company for 2 years but didn't know how to report it safely. Your testimony showed me that there are protections for employees who expose this kind of fraud." Working with investigative journalists from the Washington Post and the New York Times, I helped expose the sophisticated methods that pharmaceutical companies were using to conceal safety risks from regulatory agencies. These articles, published over several weeks following my testimony, provided detailed explanations of how clinical trial data could be manipulated while maintaining the appearance of scientific rigor. The media coverage generated additional sources who contacted me with information about fraud at companies throughout the pharmaceutical industry. I began serving as an informal clearinghouse for pharmaceutical employees who wanted to report research misconduct but needed guidance about legal protections and appropriate reporting channels. Patient advocacy organizations invited me to speak at conferences and educational events where I could directly inform patients and healthcare providers about red flags that might indicate concealed safety risks. These presentations allowed me to teach the same data analysis skills I'd used to detect Meridian's fraud, empowering others to critically evaluate pharmaceutical research claims. The American Association of Pharmaceutical Scientists asked me to lead a task force on research integrity that would develop new standards for detecting and preventing clinical trial fraud. This work involved collaboration with FDA officials, academic researchers, and industry representatives who were committed to improving ethical standards throughout pharmaceutical research. My testimony also prompted congressional hearings focused specifically on pharmaceutical fraud and regulatory oversight. I was invited to participate in multiple sessions where lawmakers examined the systemic failures that had allowed companies like Meridian to operate criminal enterprises with minimal oversight. These hearings led to proposed legislation that would strengthen whistleblower protections and increase penalties for pharmaceutical fraud. The platform I'd gained through congressional testimony allowed me to advocate for specific policy changes that would make future fraud more difficult to execute and easier to detect. Working with legislative staff, I helped draft provisions that would require pharmaceutical companies to provide complete clinical trial databases to FDA reviewers, rather than summary reports that could conceal safety signals. University medical schools began inviting me to speak to students and faculty about research ethics and the moral obligations of pharmaceutical scientists. These presentations allowed me to influence the next generation of researchers, emphasizing that patient safety must always take priority over commercial considerations. International regulatory agencies also sought my expertise about detecting and preventing pharmaceutical fraud. I testified before European medicines regulators and provided consultation to agencies in Canada, Australia, and Japan about improving oversight of clinical trial data integrity. The correspondence I received from patients and families affected by Meridian's fraud provided constant reminders of why this work was meaningful beyond academic or professional considerations. A mother from Denver wrote, "My daughter nearly died from a hypoglycemic episode caused by Glucomax. Your testimony helped her doctors understand what had happened and prevented other children from experiencing the same danger." Perhaps most importantly, the platform I'd gained allowed me to encourage other potential whistleblowers to find the courage to report pharmaceutical fraud. Over the following months, I received information about research misconduct at 7 different pharmaceutical companies, leading to additional federal investigations and congressional oversight. The transformation from isolated employee to public advocate had been completed in ways I never could have anticipated. My decision to expose Meridian's fraud had evolved into a broader mission to reform pharmaceutical research practices and protect patients from corporate criminals who prioritize profits over human lives. The platform that had emerged from my willingness to risk my career for patient safety was now being used to help others find their own courage to speak truth to power in an industry that desperately needed ethical leadership. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in March 2021, 8 months after my congressional testimony had set in motion a series of investigations that would reshape the pharmaceutical industry. FBI Agent Sarah Chen was calling to inform me that the Department of Justice had reached a decision about the criminal charges against Meridian BioTech and its executives. Dr. Rodriguez, I wanted to personally notify you that the grand jury has returned indictments against Dr. Marcus Blackwood and 6 other Meridian executives on charges including conspiracy to defraud the United States, wire fraud, and endangering public health, Agent Chen said, her voice carrying a satisfaction that reflected 2 years of meticulous investigation. The evidence you provided was instrumental in securing these indictments, which carry potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. But the criminal charges were only the beginning of the recognition that would follow. Within hours of the indictments being unsealed, I received a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office informing me that I would be receiving the largest whistleblower award in pharmaceutical industry history under the False Claims Act. The $47 million award represented a percentage of the $2.3 billion in fines and penalties that Meridian would pay to resolve federal criminal and civil charges. Dr. Rodriguez, this award reflects not just the financial value of your disclosures, but the extraordinary courage you demonstrated in exposing criminal conduct that was directly endangering patients, explained Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Harrison during the formal notification call. Your willingness to risk your career to protect public health exemplifies the highest ideals of scientific integrity. The financial recognition was staggering, but even more meaningful was the vindication it represented. For months after my congressional testimony, Meridian's legal team had waged a campaign to discredit my allegations and portray me as a disgruntled employee seeking financial gain. The federal government's decision to validate my claims with the largest whistleblower award in industry history definitively established that my allegations had been both accurate and crucial for protecting public health, Time magazine featured me on their cover as one of the heroes of medical ethics, with a story that detailed how my investigation had exposed systematic fraud throughout the pharmaceutical industry. The article described me as a researcher whose commitment to scientific integrity transformed her from industry insider to public protector, demonstrating that individual courage can challenge corporate power when patient safety is at stake. The recognition extended far beyond media coverage to include honors from institutions that had shaped my career and values. Stanford University, where I'd completed my PhD, awarded me their Distinguished Alumni Medal for Public Service, citing my extraordinary commitment to research integrity that has protected countless patients and improved ethical standards throughout pharmaceutical research. Congressional leaders from both parties who had participated in the oversight hearings where I testified issued joint statements praising my contributions to improving pharmaceutical safety. Representative Maria Gonzalez, whose father had been harmed by glucomax, wrote, Dr. Rodriguez's courage in exposing Meridian's fraud prevented countless families from experiencing the preventable medical emergencies that my family endured. Her testimony fundamentally changed how Congress approaches pharmaceutical oversight. The recognition wasn't limited to American institutions. The World Health Organization invited me to join their advisory committee on research ethics, where I would help develop international standards for detecting and preventing clinical trial fraud. The European Medicines Agency asked me to serve as a consultant on improving oversight of pharmaceutical research conducted by multinational companies. Medical schools across the country began incorporating case studies based on my whistleblowing experience into their research ethics curricula. Harvard Medical School developed an entire course around the Meridian case, using my investigation as a framework for teaching students about moral courage and professional responsibility in pharmaceutical research. The Journal of Medical Ethics published a special issue featuring my experiences as a whistleblower, along with commentary from leading bioethicists about the systemic changes needed to prevent similar fraud in the future. The editor wrote that my case represents a watershed moment in pharmaceutical ethics, demonstrating that individual scientists have both the power and the responsibility to hold their industry accountable to the highest ethical standards. Patient advocacy organizations presented me with awards recognizing my efforts to protect vulnerable populations from corporate fraud. The American Diabetes Association honored me with their advocacy award, noting that my exposure of glucomax's concealed safety risks had prevented potentially thousands of severe hypoglycemic episodes among diabetes patients. The financial award from my whistleblowing enabled me to establish the Rodriguez Foundation for Pharmaceutical Ethics, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting other potential whistleblowers and improving research integrity throughout the medical industry. The foundation provides legal support, financial assistance, and psychological counseling for pharmaceutical employees who want to report research misconduct but fear retaliation. Universities began competing to recruit me for faculty positions that would allow me to continue my work on research integrity while training the next generation of ethical pharmaceutical scientists. The University of California, San Francisco offered me an endowed chair in medical ethics and pharmaceutical research, with complete freedom to pursue investigations of industry misconduct. The pharmaceutical industry itself, albeit reluctantly, began recognizing my contributions to improving research standards. Several major companies invited me to consult on developing more robust internal oversight mechanisms, acknowledging that my expertise in detecting fraud could help them avoid the catastrophic legal and financial consequences that had destroyed Meridian BioTech. Speaking invitations poured in from medical conferences, regulatory agencies, and academic institutions around the world. My calendar filled with opportunities to share my experience and advocate for stronger ethical standards in pharmaceutical research. Each presentation was an opportunity to inspire other scientists to prioritize patient safety over corporate pressure. The recognition extended to my family, whose support had been crucial during the most difficult periods of my whistleblowing journey. Carmen was invited to speak at diabetes advocacy events about the importance of pharmaceutical transparency, sharing her perspective as a patient whose life had been directly affected by corporate fraud. My parents, who had instilled in me the moral principles that guided my decision to speak out, were honored at community events recognizing their role in raising a daughter who had protected public health. Perhaps most significantly, the recognition I received helped validate the choices of other pharmaceutical employees who were considering whether to report research misconduct at their own companies. The success of my case demonstrated that whistleblowing could lead to meaningful consequences for corporate criminals while providing legal and financial protection for the employees who exposed them. The awards and recognition represented more than personal validation. They were acknowledgement that individual scientists could successfully challenge corporate power when armed with evidence, legal support, and moral conviction. The recognition also carried responsibility, as I became a symbol of what pharmaceutical research could be when conducted with integrity and accountability. The transformation from isolated researcher to internationally recognized advocate for pharmaceutical ethics was complete. But the recognition also marked the beginning of a new phase of my career dedicated to ensuring that other scientists would never have to choose between their careers and their consciences when confronting research misconduct. By December 2021. The ripple effects of my whistleblowing had fundamentally transformed pharmaceutical research oversight in ways that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. The Meridian case had become a catalyst for the most comprehensive reform of drug safety regulation since the establishment of the FDA, with new legislation, enforcement mechanisms, and industry standards that would protect patients for generations to come. The Pharmaceutical Integrity and Patient Safety Act, which Congress passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, incorporated many of the recommendations I had made during my testimony. The law required pharmaceutical companies to provide complete, unedited clinical trial databases to FDA reviewers, eliminating the selective reporting that had enabled Meridian's fraud. Companies that failed to comply faced automatic market withdrawal of their products and criminal penalties for executives. Dr. Rodriguez's investigation revealed systematic weaknesses in our regulatory framework that had been exploited by bad actors for years, said FDA Commissioner Dr. Janet Morrison during the bill signing ceremony. This legislation ensures that no pharmaceutical company will ever again be able to conceal safety risks from the agencies responsible for protecting public health. The new law also established mandatory prison sentences for pharmaceutical executives who knowingly concealed safety data, with penalties ranging from 5 to 30 years depending on the severity of patient harm. The legislation created a dedicated FBI unit focused exclusively on pharmaceutical fraud, with agents trained specifically to detect the sophisticated data manipulation techniques that companies like Meridian had used to evade detection. My role in these reforms extended far beyond my initial whistleblowing testimony. I had been appointed to serve on the FDA's newly created Advisory Committee on Research Integrity, where I helped develop the technical standards that pharmaceutical companies would be required to meet under the new legislation. The committee's work involved creating algorithms that could automatically detect statistical anomalies suggesting data manipulation, based on the fraud detection methods I had pioneered during my investigation of Meridian. The international impact of my case was equally significant. The European Union implemented new regulations requiring pharmaceutical companies to submit complete clinical trial datasets to the European Medicines Agency, closing loopholes that had previously allowed selective reporting of safety data. Similar reforms were adopted by regulatory agencies in Canada, Australia, Japan, and 12 other countries, creating a global framework for preventing pharmaceutical fraud. Universities around the world began establishing research integrity programs, modeled on the curriculum I had developed at UC San Francisco, where I had accepted the endowed chair in medical ethics and pharmaceutical research. My course, Detecting and Preventing Research Misconduct, became one of the most popular electives at the medical school, with waiting lists of students eager to learn the investigative techniques that had exposed Meridian's criminal activities. The textbook I authored, Pharmaceutical Fraud, A Scientist's Guide to Protecting Patients, became required reading in medical ethics courses at over 200 universities worldwide. The book provided detailed case studies of research misconduct, step-by-step guides for detecting data manipulation, and practical advice for potential whistleblowers considering whether to report fraud at their own institutions. Major pharmaceutical companies, recognizing that the regulatory environment had permanently changed, began implementing the internal oversight mechanisms I had recommended during congressional testimony. Johnson & Johnson hired me as a consultant to develop their new research integrity program, acknowledging that external expertise was necessary to identify blind spots that internal teams might miss. Dr. Rodriguez brings a perspective that simply isn't available from traditional compliance consultants, explained J&J's Chief Scientific Officer Dr. Amanda Chen during the announcement of our partnership. Her experience exposing systematic fraud makes her uniquely qualified to help us ensure that our research practices meet the highest ethical standards. The Rodriguez Foundation for Pharmaceutical Ethics, which I had established using my whistleblower award, had grown into a major force for reform throughout the medical industry. The foundation provided legal support for 47 pharmaceutical employees who reported research misconduct over its first 2 years of operation, leading to federal investigations of fraud at 12 different companies. The foundation's work resulted in additional criminal prosecutions, with executives from 3 pharmaceutical companies receiving prison sentences for concealing safety data from regulatory agencies. These cases demonstrated that the Meridian prosecution wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a sustained effort to hold the pharmaceutical industry accountable for criminal conduct. Speaking engagements had become a central part of my mission to prevent future pharmaceutical fraud. I delivered over 150 presentations during 2021 alone, addressing audiences ranging from medical students to senior FDA officials to international regulatory conferences. Each presentation was an opportunity to share the investigative techniques that had exposed Meridian's fraud while encouraging other scientists to prioritize patient safety over corporate loyalty. The most meaningful speaking engagement was my keynote address at the International Conference on Research Ethics in Geneva, where I spoke to representatives from regulatory agencies in 45 countries. The presentation, titled From Complicity to Courage, A Scientist's Journey to Protecting Patients, became a model for training programs designed to encourage ethical leadership in pharmaceutical research. Dr. Rodriguez has shown that individual scientists have the power to challenge corporate corruption when they have the courage to act on their convictions, said Dr. Liu Wei, director of China's National Medical Products Administration, following my presentation. Her example is inspiring. Regulatory reforms and ethical training programs throughout Asia. The success of my advocacy work extended to policy victories that would have seemed impossible when I first discovered Meridian's fraud. The Department of Justice announced the creation of a $500 million fund to compensate patients who had been harmed by pharmaceuticals with concealed safety risks, with eligibility determinations based on the evidence standards I had helped develop. Congress established the Office of Pharmaceutical Integrity within the Department of Health and Human Services, with authority to investigate research misconduct and coordinate with law enforcement agencies. I was invited to serve on the advisory board that would guide the office's priorities and methodology, ensuring that the investigative techniques I had pioneered would be institutionalized within the federal government. The pharmaceutical industry's response to these reforms demonstrated their effectiveness. Several major companies voluntarily disclosed safety issues that they had previously concealed, acknowledging that the new regulatory environment made continued concealment too risky. These voluntary disclosures resulted in updated warning labels and prescribing restrictions that protected patients from preventable adverse events. Patent applications I had filed for fraud detection algorithms were generating licensing revenue that funded additional research integrity initiatives. Pharmaceutical companies were paying to use the same tools that had exposed Meridian's fraud, creating a self-reinforcing system where industry profits supported the development of better oversight mechanisms. The academic recognition of my work culminated in my election to the National Academy of Medicine, one of the highest honors available to medical researchers. The citation specifically recognized my extraordinary contributions to pharmaceutical ethics and patient safety that have transformed an entire industry's approach to research integrity. Media coverage of my continuing work maintained public attention on pharmaceutical reform, ensuring that companies couldn't retreat to their previous practices once the initial scrutiny died down. Documentary filmmakers, investigative journalists, and public television producers regularly featured my story as an example of how individual courage could drive systematic change. The success measured itself not just in awards and recognition, but in the concrete improvements to patient safety that had resulted from my decision to expose Meridian's fraud. FDA data showed that adverse event reporting had increased by 340% since the implementation of new disclosure requirements, indicating that pharmaceutical companies were finally providing accurate safety information to regulatory agencies. The transformation from isolated pharmaceutical researcher to leading advocate for industry reform was complete, but the success also represented a new beginning. The platform I had built through whistleblowing had become a permanent force for ethical pharmaceutical research, ensuring that the sacrifices required to expose Meridian's fraud would continue protecting patients long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. 5 years after that terrifying night when I first discovered the falsified glucomax data in my empty office, I stood before a packed auditorium at Johns Hopkins Medical School, looking out at 300 first-year medical students who would soon enter a pharmaceutical industry that had been fundamentally transformed by the events I was about to describe. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now teaching future doctors about research integrity in the same field where I had once been complicit in systematic fraud. The patient lying in bed 47B of the cardiac intensive care unit at Seattle General Hospital doesn't know my name, I began, my voice carrying across the silent auditorium. But her life was saved because I finally found the courage to prioritize scientific integrity over personal comfort. Maria Santos, a 34-year-old mother of 2, was one of the last patients to suffer a severe hypoglycemic episode from glucomax before our investigation led to updated safety warnings that prevented thousands of similar emergencies. The students leaned forward as I continued. 5 years ago, I thought my greatest professional achievement was earning a director-level position at a prestigious pharmaceutical company. Today, I understand that my greatest achievement was destroying that career to protect people I would never meet. The path from respected researcher to federal whistleblower taught me that our true legacy isn't measured by personal success, but by our willingness to sacrifice for principles that transcend individual ambition. After my presentation, a second-year student named David Chen approached me with a question that perfectly captured why this work remained essential. Dr. Rodriguez, how do we ensure that the reforms you helped create don't get weakened over time? How do we make sure that future pharmaceutical researchers maintain the courage to speak up when they witness misconduct? His question reflected the eternal challenge of institutional change, sustaining ethical progress across generations of professionals who might not fully understand the struggles that created current protections. David, that's exactly why I spend so much time in classrooms like this one, I replied. Each generation of scientists needs to understand that research integrity isn't just an abstract ideal, it's a daily choice that can literally determine whether patients live or die. The Rodriguez Foundation had evolved beyond supporting individual whistleblowers to become a comprehensive center for pharmaceutical ethics education and advocacy. Our annual budget of $12 million supported research integrity programs at 78 universities, legal assistance for 200+ potential whistleblowers, and policy advocacy that had prevented several attempts by pharmaceutical lobbying groups to weaken the disclosure requirements we'd fought to establish. My sister Carmen had become one of the Foundation's most effective advocates, speaking at diabetes conferences about the importance of pharmaceutical transparency from a patient's perspective. Her presentations consistently drew standing ovations from audiences who understood that corporate fraud wasn't an abstract policy issue, it was a matter of life and death for people whose survival depended on accurate medical information. Elena showed me that patients have power when we demand honesty from pharmaceutical companies, Carmen told a packed auditorium at the American Diabetes Association's annual conference. But that power only works when we have allies inside the industry who are willing to risk their careers to protect us. Her courage gave me hope that pharmaceutical companies could be forced to prioritize patient safety over profits. The next generation of pharmaceutical researchers was growing up in an environment where research integrity was emphasized from the beginning of their training rather than treated as an afterthought. Medical schools now required courses on detecting and reporting research misconduct, using case studies based on my investigation of Meridian to teach students about the real-world consequences of ethical failures. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had been instrumental in building the FBI's case against Meridian, was now directing the federal government's pharmaceutical fraud unit, which had grown from a small task force to a 200-person operation. Elena's case proved that pharmaceutical fraud could be successfully prosecuted when investigators had access to comprehensive evidence and insider knowledge, she explained during a recent conference call. The investigative methods she pioneered have become standard protocol for all our pharmaceutical fraud investigations. The international impact of my work continued to expand as more countries adopted the oversight mechanisms we had developed. The World Health Organization had established the Global Initiative for Pharmaceutical Integrity, based largely on the reforms that emerged from the Meridian case. I served as the initiative's founding chair, helping coordinate anti-fraud efforts across 6 continents. Perhaps most significantly, the pharmaceutical industry itself had embraced many of the ethical standards that had once seemed impossibly idealistic. Companies that had initially resisted increased oversight now competed to demonstrate their commitment to research integrity, recognizing that ethical leadership had become a competitive advantage in a market where patients and providers demanded transparency. The annual Meridian Memorial Lecture, which I delivered each year at UC San Francisco, had become one of the most prestigious events in pharmaceutical ethics. The 2026 lecture drew attendees from 45 countries, including regulatory officials, pharmaceutical executives, patient advocates, and researchers who wanted to understand how individual courage had catalyzed industry-wide transformation. The flash drive that I handed to FBI Agent Sarah Chen 5 years ago contained evidence that would ultimately protect millions of patients from corporate fraud, I told the international audience. But the most important lesson from the Meridian case isn't about the specific techniques we use to detect fraud, it's about the responsibility that every pharmaceutical professional has to prioritize patient safety over personal security. The ripple effects of my decision to become a whistleblower continued to generate new protections for patients worldwide. The European Medicines Agency had just announced the creation of a real-time adverse event monitoring system based on algorithms I had developed, which would automatically detect safety signals that pharmaceutical companies might try to conceal. Similar systems were being implemented in Asia, South America, and Africa. My textbook on pharmaceutical fraud detection had been translated into 12 languages and was being used to train regulatory officials in countries that were developing their own oversight capabilities. Each translation represented thousands of patients who would be protected by investigators who understood how to identify corporate misconduct. The personal transformation that had begun with burned garlic and a mother-in-law's text message, "Wait, that was someone else's story." My transformation had begun with falsified clinical trial data and a moral crisis that nearly destroyed my faith in pharmaceutical research. But the journey from complicity to courage had taught me that our greatest struggles often prepare us for our most meaningful contributions. Students often asked me whether I regretted the career I had lost when I decided to expose Meridian's fraud. I didn't lose a career, I would tell them. I traded a job that required me to be silent about patient endangerment for a mission that allows me to speak truth to power every single day. The researcher who was terrified of losing her prestigious position at Meridian BioTech was never going to change the world. The federal whistleblower who risked everything to protect patients created a legacy that will outlast any individual career. The evidence I had gathered in those desperate months of secret investigation had grown into a global movement for pharmaceutical transparency that protected patients in ways I could never have imagined. But the most profound change hadn't been in industry regulations or federal oversight, it had been in my understanding of what it meant to be a scientist whose work truly served humanity. As I looked out at those medical students representing the future of pharmaceutical research, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that struggle had been transformed into strength, that personal sacrifice had generated public benefit, and that individual courage had proved capable of challenging institutional corruption. The woman who had once hidden behind confidentiality agreements and career ambitions had become someone who spent every day ensuring that future researchers would never have to choose between their consciences and their careers. The legacy wasn't just the legislation, the awards, or the recognition, it was the knowledge that pharmaceutical fraud would never again be as easy to execute or as difficult to expose as it had been when I first discovered Meridian's criminal activities. That transformation, more than any personal achievement, justified every sleepless night, every legal threat, and every moment of uncertainty that had marked my journey from pharmaceutical insider to public protector. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.